Archer Mullen, and Bill Carlton.
Thank you, Pat. At the outset, I want to make a couple of preliminary comments. Let there be no mistake about it. I want to make this perfectly clear. We have never narrated a style show. I have from time to time been involved in tasteless skits at a small men's club which best remain nameless. So therefore, we come to you tonight obviously, completely, and eminently unqualified for the job, but admittedly thoroughly enjoying it. My lovely co-narrator has been given the task of describing the very beautiful gowns and their accessories and handling all the difficult words, while I have been relegated the job of relating a vast and almost overwhelming amount of historical and technical data about the era in which each of these gowns was worn. My history teacher, Miss Truxton, would be proud of me. Welcome to First Ladies on Parade. The collections of gowns you will see today form an historical pageantry of beauty. All of these gowns are replicas of the original dresses preserved in the Smithsonian Institution's First Ladies collection.
The designers of the gowns sketched the dresses in the finest detail at the Smithsonian. No patterns were available, so the designers draped fabrics and created their own patterns. The fabrics were then selected to duplicate the materials of each original gown. Each gown is a handmade dressmaker copy valued at $750 to $1,200. Each one is insured for $1,000.
The 22 gowns are the property of Dr. and Mrs. Edwin Deere and are available for fundraising events throughout the country.
Today, we will relive a part of history. So imagine the inaugural of President George Washington in 1789. Martha Washington wore this salmon pink and oyster floral ribbon brocade gown. It is probably the most dated in the collection, being typical of the 18th century in both workmanship and design. The deep square neckline of the basque bodice is etched in fine, handmade ivory lace. The waistline of the bodice comes to a double point in the front and a single point in the back. The dress does fasten in the front. The skirt falls in deep pleats at the back and sides, so the front is plain. The dirndl effect is created by a wooden saddle attached under the dress and fitting snugly at the waist. It is often thought that the ladies of Washington's time wore powdered wigs. Mrs. Washington never wore a wig or powdered her hair, but rather wore a lace mop cap for all social occasions. Corkscrew curls, currently so popular, were the height of hairdo fashion in the late 1780s.
Representing Mrs. Washington, we have Frances Saxton. As the nation's first lady, Martha was a president's wife without a permanent executive mansion. She entertained at Mount Vernon, New York, and Philadelphia, and set the pattern for others to follow. With all that traveling, can't you think of a more practical, easy-to-pack basic dress?
Martha Washington was succeeded as First Lady by Mrs. John Adams. The Adamses' inaugural took place in Philadelphia in 1797. Mrs. Adams wore this heavy silk sapphire blue gown. The interesting detail of the bodice is created by 5 diagonal tucks running from the shoulder seam to the point of the basque waistline in front. The straight-cut skirt is sheared at the waistline and has a 20-inch border of hand-embroidered design which matches the color of the dress.
Modeling this gown beautifully is Cookie Wilkerson. Abigail Adams was a first lady with lots of spunk. Before her husband ever came to the White House, when he was signing the Declaration of Independence, she encouraged him to remember women and their rights. She declared they would foment a rebellion if the men did not. Who says women lived is new.
Abigail Adams was the only first lady to publish a diary of her experiences as the president's wife. Unfortunately, Mrs. Johnson has broken that long-held record.
Jan Zink wears the gown of the delightful Dolly Madison, who served as First Lady from 1809 to 1817. She was charming, witty, and daring, saving many valuable French paintings which she had imported when the British burned the Capitol. Washington Irving called her a fine, portly, buxom dame. I'd say he was pretty daring. At a time when the nation was in its second war with England, she was an inspiration to the country.
Dolly's inaugural gown with matching coat is reminiscent of the gowns worn by Queen Elizabeth. The heavy gold satin dress and coat are hand embroidered in a blue and green floral and butterfly motif. With this gown, we see the first entrance of empire styling, which faded in and out of popularity over the next 2 centuries. The long sleeves are actually attached to the dress. The coat arm is finished in a short cap sleeve. Dolly's original empire hairstyle was accented by a turban band, which matches the fabric of her dress.
It is said her turban budget alone was $1,000 a year, much to the disgust of some ladies. Looks as if Jackie's wasn't the only First Lady with a clothes budget problem. While she failed to carry on the elaborate entertainment established by Dolly Madison, Elizabeth Monroe has left a lasting impression on the White House. She and her husband lived in Paris while he served as American minister. Mrs. Monroe dramatically intervened to save Madame Lafayette from the guillotine. When they returned, they furnished the White House in the Parisian and European style. A few highly prized Monroe pieces are still used in the White House today.
Sharon Campbell shows us Mrs. Monroe's warp-printed silk satin gown, which gives the appearance of cut velvet. Made along redingote lines, the suspender-like panels of Point de Venetian lace frame the neckline and in at the waist. Down the side fronts of the overskirt are applique scrolls of brocade and scattered tufts. The key feature of the dress is the Watteau back with inverted pleats falling from the back of the neck over the waist and into the skirt, which Sharon might find used in one of the gowns of her own wardrobe. The music you are hearing is a medley of songs historically appropriated for the eras of the various inaugurals.
John Quincy Adams became the country's 6th president in 1825, 1 year after Blissfield was founded. His wife, Louisa, moved into a still unfurnished White House, a plight her mother-in-law had endured 25 years before.
Louisa Adams' gown could be worn today. Her husband came to office when the Empire-style gowns were at their fashion height, and the London-born Louisa, who had lived in Moscow and Paris, wore them as well as does Carolyn Klump. Her dress is of heavy white silk satin, and the low round neckline is edged with a ruching of illusion and silver braid. Silver embroidered net also decorate the puff sleeves and the bell-shaped skirts.
John Quincy Adams served as American minister to Moscow prior to his term as president. While in Russia, they became involved in the 100-Day War. Louisa's health was seriously damaged as a result of her flight from Russia during the war. John Quincy Adams was the only president who returned to Congress as a representative after his term. Martin Van Buren had been a widower for 17 years when he was elected president. He moved into the White House in 1836 with 4 bachelor sons and no first lady. During 1838, his son, Abram, met and married Angelica Singleton, who became the country's official hostess.
This gown was worn at Angelica's first public appearance, a New Year's reception in 1839. Our model is Shirley La Follette. With this gown, we see the entrance of the hoop skirt in the fashion picture. The dress, fashioned in lion's-type royal blue velvet, has a sweeping double circular skirt, sheared at the waistline and falling into beautiful folds, forming a circular train. The off-the-shoulder neckline is covered with a bertha of lace. Note that her hairstyle is topped with an ostrich plume.
Angelica and her husband traveled in Europe after their marriage. Upon their return, she attempted to introduce European customs into social entertaining as had other first ladies, and she was met with the same criticism. Even as late as 1840, American citizens were sensitive about their break with England in the Revolution. Before coming to the White House, Carolyn Harrison had spent 6 years in Washington as the wife of the senator from Indiana, and she knew both politics and society in the nation's capital when she returned 2 years later as a first lady. Her dinners and receptions were brilliant affairs. She captured many of her countrymen's hearts by insisting her inaugural gown be made entirely of American goods and trimmings, and her gown was no less beautiful as illustrated by Jane Kilchman.
The gown is made in 3 different fabrics. The bodice and back panel of the skirt are ivory silk satin. The 4 panels of the front skirt are ombre cut velvet, and the underskirt of pleats of silk. The V neckline is edged with beaded fringe, which is repeated on the illusion dicky and elaborate sleeves.
A special feature of the gown is a dog collar of embroidery and beads, which looks, as they say, very now. A more Puritan and informal atmosphere pervaded the White House during the presidency of James Polk. Historian Carl Fish said Polk was the least conspicuous man who had ever been nominated. Guess that record has been broken. His wife, Sarah, was the first lady to be schooled in a recognized advanced institution for the education of women. In case you are wondering where, it was the Moravian Institute of Salem, North Carolina. How advanced can you get? She was more a political competent than a hostess, and did not believe in dancing or refreshments at White House functions. However, informal receptions became popular as they made it possible for many people to meet the president and his wife on easier footing.
Her inaugural gown is certainly not puritanical or without color. Made of blue cut velvet brocade and matching blue silk satin, it uses both overskirts and underskirts. The stiffly stayed bodice emphasizes the small waistline and high bosom, which were so fashionable, and the wide line gives breadth to the shoulders. Showing this gown to good advantage is Sally Jacobs.
Everything he pledged to do during his campaign was completed by President James Polk, the only president to ever succeed in this mighty task. He left office at the height of his popularity. When former school teacher Abigail Fillmore came to the White House in 1850, she quickly made 2 additions, a bathtub and a library. Nothing like a clean bookworm. The First Lady was in poor health and preferred family life, so she entertained very little. Since old Millard didn't smoke, drink, or gamble, it must have had made throwing parties a little tough whether she was sick or not.
Abigail's inaugural gown is worn by Lois Bailey. The beautiful pink satin embroidered gown of Mrs. Fillmore must have been very becoming to a person with her fair coloring, just as it is to Lois's. Small waists were an admired feature in the 1850s, and as a result, bodices of this period were designed with deep points and the fullness of the skirts distributed to emphasize a small waist. The low oval neck is finished with a banding of fine silk net. This banding continues over the bust line and is separated with fine pink satin cording. The embroidery on the skirt increases toward the hemline of the dress and is accented with a ruching of matching satin. A shawl of handmade lace completed the costume. As the wife of the first Republican president, Mary Todd Lincoln faced a problem that the GOP has today. She was criticized for whatever she did, for being frivolous if she entertained during a time of civil war, and for failing to lighten the gloom if she didn't. Jenny Coleman won't be criticized for her appearance in this inaugural gown. Made in Mrs. Lincoln's favorite color, shades of lavender and purple, it has a tight bodice and full skirt of the hoop skirt era. The seams are piped in off-white cording, and at the neckline is the still present lace.
Mrs. Abraham Lincoln was one of the controversial and tragic first ladies in our history. A Southerner, she had relatives fighting on both sides in the Civil War and found it difficult to convince the American people of her loyalty. The death of her husband and both of her sons drove her to near madness during the last few years of her life.
In this gown of Julia Dent Grant, worn by Marionette Schultz, we see an excellent example of the transition from hoop skirts to the bustle. The fabric is pale green and white brocade combined with olive silk. The fullness of the skirt is gathered at the back, the first suggestion of a bustle. The long train adds to the regal appearance of the gown. The skirt is opened in front to show the olive underskirt.
The song, "Carry Me Back to Old Virginia," was written especially for Grant's inaugural. Mrs. Grant, who had worried for the safety of her husband during the Civil War, enjoyed the luxury and security of the White House. She became very popular with the American people by entertaining groups of veterans who came to the White House to pay their respect to their former commander. Grant, so shy he claimed none had ever seen him naked since he was a boy, hated war and politics. And yet this short, stumpy man was the North's most successful military leader, and twice, despite political difficulties, was elected president. After completing his term of office, the Grants took a triumph 2-year tour of the world. Not a bad idea for us after this job.
Mrs. James Garfield presided over the White House for only 4 months before an assassin's bullet struck her husband. She was a woman of great charm and dignity. Mrs. Garfield's gown is an unusually graceful interpretation of the period of fashion ruled by the bustle. The ivory satin gown has flounces of exquisite Brussels point lace draped across the front. Bands of matching satin fabric seem to hold the shirred lace. The train of the dress is trimmed in puffs of the dress fabric. Our model, Pauline Zimmerman, emulates Mrs. Garfield's hairstyle, which was a top roll.
James Garfield had been the youngest Civil War general and a member of Congress before becoming president. Sadly, a job which under normal circumstances he would never have had, for he was a compromise candidate, nominated on the 36th ballot after a deadlock between Blaine and Grant. It is interesting to note that in those days the rotunda of the Capitol was used as a bazaar where such things as buggy whips, mouse traps, and snake oil was sold. One of the first things Grover Cleveland did as president was to become engaged to Frances Folsom. They were married in the White House, and the youthful and charming First Lady became the nation's favorite. During her husband's second term in office, she had 2 children, both born in the White House.
Mrs. Cleveland was so popular that it has been said that the bustle became unfashionable because she disliked it. Her inaugural gown was a skirt that fits snugly over the hips and then flares to the floor in a bell. The pink and green war-printed cloak fabric is emphasized by the pink velvet, which encircles the waistline and edges the neckline, forming puffed undersleeves. Spangled sequin butterflies nestle at the bosom and on the shoulder. Sandy Chris makes a perfect Frances Cleveland.
Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He left office during the Harrison administration and was reelected in 1893. He was not the only president to face some perplexing problems, which are also very now. A bomb thrown in Haymarket Square, Chicago, killed 7 policemen. New York City was shut down for days after a 20-inch snowfall. Eugene Debs boycotted the railroad, and Cox's army of unemployed marched on Washington. President Teddy Roosevelt came to the White House following the assassination of William McKinley. The motto of the first president of the 20th century could well have been a line from Browning: "I was ever a fighter." As a boy, he fought and won over asthma and a puny build. He boxed at Harvard, attacked the corrupt legislators in New York, led a charge up a hill with a troop of cowboys, Indians, and Eastern football players. He recruited, and then he had enough steam left to remodel the White House, replacing Victorian gingerbread with all sorts of stuffed animal heads.
Mrs. Roosevelt's inaugural gown is modeled by Eva Wagner. The original loom setting for the fabric was destroyed after her garment was made, but its colors of robin's egg blue and gold were copied exactly. The skirt narrows at the waist and falls into deep folds, forming a long train. The simple bodice has a square neckline edged in rose point lace. Mrs. Roosevelt wore her hair in a modified Gibson girl style, as Eva is.
During the Roosevelt administration, the progressive era began. Perry reached the North Pole. The Wright brothers took off, and so did America's economy. As an example, John D. Rockefeller's net worth from his oil ventures was said to match the damage caused by the San Francisco earthquake, $300 million. Then the trust came busting down. Before becoming the nation's First Lady, Helen Taft had been the Philippines' First Lady when her husband had governed those islands. She also had experience as a Washington hostess, as her husband was Secretary of War under Teddy Roosevelt when he was making a phenomenal rise to power. She brought to the White House her diplomatic and political training. One of the most outstanding social affairs of their session was the garden party given to celebrate the presidential couple's silver wedding anniversary.
Mrs. Taft's inaugural gown, modeled by Carol Bierman, was the first to be received by the Smithsonian and is probably the outstanding gown in the collection. It is designed in a revival of the Empire fashion which was taking place in 1909. The fabric is white silk georgette over silk crepe, and hours of work created all the lavish embroidery and jewelry that almost completely cover the gown.
William Taft was the only president to serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after his term as president was completed. But this was not his only first. At 6'2" and over 300 pounds, Big Bill was certainly our biggest president. First to play golf, first to throw out the first baseball of the baseball season, and first to have an executive car. While around the country, Caruso's voice was raising opera to new heights. Henry Ford turned out 1,000 Model Ts per day, and the Los Angeles Times office was bombed, killing 21.
Edith Wilson, like Frances Cleveland, was a White House bride. The widow, Edith Galt, and widower Woodrow Wilson met at the White House and were married there in 1915. For Wilson's second inaugural in 1917, Edith Wilson wore this narrow-skirted gown, very fashionable for the times. The dress suggests a tunic over the narrow skirt. Panels of black sequins ornament the back of the tunic and form the train. The square neckline is trimmed in jet beads, and jet tassels fall from the tulle sleeves. Loops of black beads are draped from front to back under the sleeves. Mrs. Joan Hamilton graciously presents the Wilson gown.
During the hard days of World War I, Mrs. Wilson provided her husband with devotion and wise counsel. As his health began to fail under the pressures of the war, he relied on her, not only for counsel, but also to handle many of his high official duties. It is said that several high-level decisions were made by Edith Wilson to prevent the nation from knowing the seriousness of President's health problem.
President Harding chose to omit the traditional parade and ball at his inaugural and permitted only the swearing-in ceremonies. For the ceremony, Mrs. Harding wore this buff-colored, satin-back crepe gown. The drape in the skirt shows an upward trend of dresses of this period. The satin neckline is low and rounded. The insert of net across the bosom is heavily embroidered with beads. The long pointed train which falls from the waist is also embroidered. The black velvet band around Marie Checkley's neck was one of Florence Harding's trademarks.
White House social activities were restricted during World War I and throughout President Wilson's illness. Now it was open for entertainment, and Mrs. Harding held many lovely parties. Ohio's 7th president was the creator of the well-known song, "It's All in the Game." He was our first chief executive to be heard over radio, and the last where someone did not demand equal time. He saw the Lincoln Memorial dedicated. The Ku Klux Klan reached its peak, and a dance marathon team set a new record of 27 hours. Although it has been said that Calvin Coolidge looked and acted like he had been weaned on a pickle, his wife, Grace, was one of the most popular first ladies in our history. Completely inexperienced in politics, the Vermont housewife quickly adapted to her role when her husband became president after Harding's sudden death, just 2 years into his first term.
Her gown, modeled here by Jean Burns, is the only representative of the short dress period in the collection. The bodice is perfectly plain with a V neckline, and the waistline is almost lowered to the hips, where a rhinestone belt encircles the figure. The skirt is made of 3 overlapping tiers of chiffon velvet, and the pointed train, unusual for a short dress, which falls from the shoulders, is of matching velvet. A single long strand of pearls was the outstanding fashion accessory of this period. The fabric of the dress is from the original bolt found in a New York warehouse.
Mr. Coolidge served in 19 public offices before becoming president, a record for our leaders, and while he was a champion of conservatism, claiming there is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, or any time, yet Leopold and Loeb were being tried for murder. Scopius was being tried for teaching evolution. Billy Mitchell bombed a ship and was tried for that. Movies started in talking, and another opinionated man flew across the Atlantic. Herbert Hoover and his wife, Lou, succeeded the Coolidges to the nation's top office. As a result of the freedom and party and happy 20s, Hoover fell heir to the Great Depression. Sadly, too, this loyal Republican may lay claim to one of the outstanding examples of talking when he should have been listening. When in his inaugural address he said, "We in America today are nearer to final triumph over poverty than ever before."
The only festive occasion of the Hoover presidency was his inaugural. Lou Hoover wore this lustrous pale green satin gown done along classic lines. The dress has a draped cowl neckline with cap sleeves that extend over the shoulders. From the waistline, 4 panels are draped in deep folds to form a pointed overskirt. The underskirt forms a deep circular train. The only decorations on the dress are 2 diamond clips on the shoulder. This gown is at its best here on Sally Hagenboo.
Lou Hoover assumed many additional responsibilities to help her husband, which previous First Ladies had not done, particularly in the public relations area. Another historical note of interest, the Star-Spangled Banner was adopted as our official national anthem during the Hoover administration. In January of 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated, moved into the big White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. Never was a First Lady better prepared to grace the home and fulfill those responsibilities than Mamie. She had been in the services with Ike for all those brilliant years, married to the man whose remarkable combinations of quality, sincerity, genuine friendliness, humanity, dedication to his country, and humility attracted deep devotion and even adulation. Mamie won the hearts of all of us, was always a warm and delightful hostess, and the newly renovated White House lent itself well to the gay and festive entertainment of the Eisenhowers.
Wearing Mrs. Eisenhower's inaugural ball gown is Ruby Newland. We all remember how dazzling our new First Lady looked in pale pink pot de soie, studded entirely with brilliants, 4,000 of them in all. It's a dream dress, a classic fairy queen dress, and made pink the color ever associated with Mamie, along with her famous bangs. She wore gloves made of the same pink silk. Ruby is wearing a perfect copy of the jewelry worn by Mrs. Eisenhower at the ball, which you may see later. The jewelry was designed by Trifari in New York especially for her gown, and this copy was presented to the collection by the Trifari Company to travel with the gown. There must have been a fairy godmother with a wand standing over here at that great night of the ball.
Mrs. John Kennedy came to the White House in 1961 as the youngest First Lady since the Cleveland administration. She brought to the 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue a long tradition of gracious living. As the daughter of John Bouvier III, a Wall Street broker, she grew up in New York and Long Island amid surroundings of wealth and social distinction. Few have ever arrived at this station of political preeminence so well prepared to meet every situation as it arose. As an adjunct to her political life, Mrs. Kennedy undertook the refurnishing of the White House. The First Lady and her associate wanted the house to be an example of elegance, with the old and beautiful furniture and paintings which symbolize the dignity of the President's house brought back. The youthful, charming, and beauty of Jacqueline have captivated audiences both here and abroad. Though she never had any great desire to have an active part in politics, she did accompany her husband on numerous trips. Her language capabilities captivated many groups of foreign dignitaries. Mrs. Kennedy was a First Lady with a wide diversification of interests. In addition to her family, her chief interests were literary and artistic. Representing the Kennedy era in the collection from the Smithsonian Institution is Pat Mallory, which in the ensemble worn by Mrs. Kennedy at the inaugural ball in January 20th, 1961, the gown and cape were designed by Ethel Franco, head of the custom design salon of Bergdorf and Goldman of New York. The cape was fashioned of white pendants with an overlay of layers of chiffon, which creates a feeling of softness. The gown's sleeveless, torso-length bodice had a high jewel neckline and is made of chiffon, which is gathered slightly at the hip line, giving a bloused effect. Peering through the gown's top is a fitted under blouse embroidered with silver, crystal, and rhinestones. As to the floor-length evening cape, the straight skirt is of podance overlaid with chiffon. A military collar topped the cape and is caught at the throat with a jeweled frog. Mrs. Kennedy completed the costume with 20 buttons, white kid gloves, and a dropped diamond earring.
Our own First Lady, Patricia Ryan Nixon, chose an inaugural gown to match her own personality. Designed by Karen Stark of Harvey Biron, it is dignified yet attractive, quietly elegant. It is of yellow Minosa Duchess double-faced satin, topped with a mini jacket of matching lace and crest with jewels. Byzantine scrolls in silver and gold jewels also appear on the mock turtleneck of the gown, which shows above the neckline of the jacket and on the cummerbund. The skirt is a narrow, bell-shaped design. The waist is fitted and flatters Mrs. Nixon's small waistline as it does on Margaret Goebel.
The Nixon inaugural cost over $2 million and was paid for by private contributions. The festivities included receptions, luncheons, a concert, and 6 inaugural balls, all of which President and Mrs. Nixon attended along with many of our local residents.
Suppose the woman's liberation movement Suppose the woman's liberation movement is very successful. Suppose that at some future inauguration, a woman is sworn in as President of the United States. What would be the inaugural attire for her spouse?
Mr. Bruce Christ shows us a possibility. Now I get to describe some clothing. This gunmetal gray velveteen jacket, which is lined with white taffeta dotted on black, is tailored in the mod manner. Black stretch pants, slightly belled, are dotted on fine whites. A black rough Pima cotton shirt accentuates the color of the suit and is finished with a complimentary black and white tie. So there.
That, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our parade of historical inaugural ball gowns. Now, we would like to invite our models back to present a grand march of history.
There you go. First, the President Spouse, Bruce Christ. Mrs. Nixon, Margaret Goebel, Jackie Kennedy, Patricia Mallory. She's going to have to come in from this side. Mamie Eisenhower, Ruby Newland, Mrs. Hoover, Sally Hagenboo, Mrs. Coolidge, Jean Burns, Mrs. Harding, Marie Checkley, Mrs. Wilson, Joanne Hamilton, Mrs. Taft, Carol Bierman, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Mrs. Teddy Roosevelt, take it back, Eva Waggoner, Frances Cleveland, Sandy Christ, Mrs. Garfield, Pauline Zimmerman, Julia Dent Grant, Marinetta Scholl, Mary Todd Lincoln, Virginia Kodelman, Abigail Fillmore, Lois Bailey, Sarah Polk, Sally Jacobs, Carolyn Harrison, Jane Kilsherman, Angelica Van Buren, Shirley LaFollette, Louisa Adams, Carolyn Klump, Elizabeth Monroe, Sharon Campbell, Molly Madison, Jan Zink, Abigail Adams, Cookie Wilkerson, Martha Washington, Fran Saxton. Thank you, Pat Mallory, for a superb commentary. To our lovely ladies, our lovely models, each of them a First Lady today, and a special thanks to our committee. Also our thanks to our very special honored guests, patrons, and each and every one of you who have shared this unique pageant with us today. Thank you for being with us, and last but not least, because that's what it's all about, for your generous financial support of the Blissfield area Sesquicentennial. The model will remain on stage for you to inspect the gowns and ask any questions that you may think of. Thank you again.